In June of 1981, in a quiet room in Whitehall, the British government decided that the aircraft carrier was finished. The defense white paper that John Knott presented that summer was a document of hard arithmetic. Britain could not afford everything. Something had to go. What went was the Royal Navy's ability to fly fighters from the sea. HMS Invincible, barely 3 years in service, was to be sold to Australia. Her older sister Hermes was to be retired, and with the two ships would go the Sea Harriers and the whole idea of British naval air power. The reasoning was sober, professional, and entirely logical. It was also, within 10 months, going to be proven wrong in the South Atlantic by the very ships it had condemned to the scrapyard. To understand why the decision looked so reasonable, you have to understand the enemy Britain expected to fight. The whole of NATO naval planning in 1981 pointed north, to the cold gap of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. The corridor the planners called the GIUK Gap. That was where Soviet submarines would try to break out into the wider Atlantic in a war, hunting the convoys that would carry American reinforcements to Europe. Stopping them was a job for attack submarines, for frigates trailing sonar arrays, and for long-range maritime patrol aircraft flying from land bases in Scotland and Norway. In that war, on that map, a small carrier full of short-legged jump jets had almost no role to play. Land-based air power would own the sky over the North Atlantic. The doctrine was coherent, it was funded, and it was confident. And every single assumption inside it was about one war, in one ocean, against one enemy, the Soviet Union, in the North Atlantic. The ships that doctrine dismissed had never been especially loved. The Invincible class had been born out of an earlier round of cuts, and to survive the budget knife at all, the Royal Navy had been forced to disguise what these ships even were. They were not called carriers. That word was politically dead. Instead, they were called through-deck cruisers, a bureaucratic fiction designed to slip a small aircraft carrying ship past a treasury that had already killed the big ones. The name was a lie, and everyone involved knew it was a lie, and the LIE was the only reason the ships existed. The Sea Harrier that flew from them was a subsonic jet with a short range and room for only a pair of missiles at a time. Set beside a supersonic Mirage, it looked like a compromise because it was one. Nobody in the Ministry of Defense in 1981 had designed this force for an expeditionary war 8,000 miles away off the coast of South America. Nobody had designed it for a real shooting war at all. It was the leftover, the thing that survived because it was too cheap to be worth cutting entirely. The story of how Britain arrived at these ships is a story of retreat. Through the late 1960s and the 1970s, one large carrier after another had gone. The plan for a new generation of full-sized fleet carriers, the CVA-01 program, was canceled outright in 1966, killed by a defense review that judged big carriers too expensive and no longer necessary. The argument was that land-based aircraft could cover anywhere the fleet needed to go. It was the same argument, in miniature, that would return 15 years later. HMS Ark Royal, the last of the big conventional carriers with her steam catapults and her heavy Phantom fighters, was sent to the breakers in 1978. When she went, Britain lost the ability to launch a fast, catapult-driven jet from the sea, and the Royal Navy assumed it had lost that ability for good. Each cut was justified by the same reasoning. The era of the fixed-wing carrier was passing. Britain's future lay elsewhere. The Invincible class and the Sea Harrier survived this long decline, not because anyone in power truly believed in them, but because a stubborn minority inside the Navy kept fighting to keep even a fragment of naval air power alive. It was a capability that endured through quiet insubordination, not through vision. Then, on the 2nd of April, 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, and every confident assumption collapsed at once. The war did not come in the North Atlantic. It came in the South. The enemy was not the Soviet Union. It was Argentina, and the islands lay in the far South Atlantic, with no friendly airfield within thousands of miles of them. There would be no land-based air power to own this sky. The only fighters Britain could put over the Falklands were fighters it could carry there by sea. Within 3 days, a naval task force was ordered out from Portsmouth, cheered off by crowds who did not yet know what they were watching. At the heart of that fleet sailed Invincible and Hermes, the two ships the government had just declared surplus, carrying the jets it had just declared obsolete. The one capability the white paper had cut was the exact capability the war now demanded. The enemy, waiting in the South Atlantic, was not a token force. The Argentine air arm fielded well over 200 aircraft, among them supersonic Mirage 3 and Dagger fighters, tough A-4 Skyhawk bombers, and a handful of Super Attendards carrying the Exocet missile that every ship in the task force had learned to fear. These aircraft flew from long, safe runways on the mainland, and their pilots were brave and well-trained. Against them, Britain could put perhaps 20 Sea Harriers, later reinforced to around 30, flying from 2 small pitching decks with no airborne early warning to tell them where the threat was coming from. On a spreadsheet, it was a fight Britain should have lost. What followed in the skies over the South Atlantic settled the argument anyway. The Sea Harrier, the jet the experts had written off as too slow to matter, held the sky against that larger air force through 6 weeks of combat. Flying in appalling weather that grounded almost everyone else, its pilots shot down roughly 20 Argentine aircraft in air combat and lost none of their own to enemy fighters. The Mirages and Skyhawks were faster, but speed was not the metric that decided the fight. The all-aspect AIM-9L Sidewinder missile, which could be fired from any angle instead of only from behind, and the tactics the Royal Navy built around it were. Without those 2 small carriers on station off the islands, there could have been no air cover, no protected amphibious landing, and no ground campaign to retake the Falklands at all. The ships the doctrine had dismissed as surplus were the single reason the war could be fought. When it was over, the consequences ran deeper than one campaign. HMS Invincible was never sold to Australia. The sale was quietly cancelled, the offer withdrawn, and the ship went on to serve the Royal Navy for another 2 decades. Hermes was not scrapped on schedule either. The not white paper, barely a year old, had been overturned. Not by a better argument, not by a change of government, by a war that arrived in the wrong place, against the wrong enemy, in exactly the way the doctrine had promised it never would. The same planners who had been so certain about the Greenland Gap now had to sit with a harder truth. Their reasoning had not been careless. Their staff work had been excellent. Their map had simply been the wrong map. And being rigorous about the wrong map had very nearly cost Britain the ships it turned out to need most. None of this was clean or cheap. The task force paid in blood and in ships. HMS Sheffield burned and sank after a single Exocet strike. So did others. The Sea Harriers could not be everywhere, and without airborne early warning, they were often blind until an attack was already in progress. The victory was narrow, and it was won by people, not by machines alone. But it was won from those 2 small decks, and it could have been won from nowhere else. That is the point the white paper had missed entirely. That is the uncomfortable lesson underneath the whole story. The danger was never that Britain lacked hardware. Britain had submarines, frigates, and a coherent plan for the war it expected. The danger was a doctrine so confident in its prediction of where the next war would happen that it cut away the one capability that war would need. Hardware can be rebuilt in a crisis, slowly and at great cost. A wrong assumption, believed hard enough to act on, cannot be uncut once the ships are already at the breakers. Britain came within a single Australian signature of scrapping the fleet that saved the Falklands. This is WarShadow, where we study the moments when doctrine quietly beats hardware. Subscribe and stay with us. The war is never fought where the planners were most certain it would not come.